Passengers in the first-class smoking room on A deck felt the collision.
There came a heavy grinding sort of a shock, beginning far ahead of us in the bows and rapidly passing along the ship and away under our feet. First-class passenger Hugh Woolner.
Passengers on the port side barely noticed the collision.
My mother felt this little bump, as she always described it, because we were a very long way from it. We were on the port side of the ship and the collision was on the starboard side of the ship, and had she been asleep, it wouldn't have wakened her. My father went away and spoke to one of the sailors and came back and said, "We've hit an iceberg. They're going to launch the lifeboats, but you'll all be back on board for breakfast." Second-class passenger Eva Hart.
Young Frank Prentice overhears a momentous conversation.
I happened to be up on the boat deck when I saw Thomas Andrews, the designer, Bruce Ismay, the chairman, and Captain Smith talking together. I heard Ismay say to Andrews, "What's the position? Is there any news?" And Andrews said, "Well, sir, the position is that she's going to sink. There's nothing that can stop us sinking. The water's just coming straight up. The bulkheads won't help her in any way at all." Assistant storekeeper, Frank Prentice.
Titanic's passengers start to become aware that all is not well.
I dressed further and went up on the deck where I found several people, for the most part men, who were going and coming, and again an officer told me that there was no danger, that one could go back to bed. Instead of that, I went on the deck and went all the way to the front where I saw sailors getting into the boats at the top of the deck. From that time I was certain of our hazardous position. For a minute I felt faint, but soon I regained my composure. Second-class passenger Mary Jerwan.
Winnie Troutt immediately went to steerage to alert her friends of the danger.
I saw them lower one lifeboat with no one in it and noticed the men were also uncovering another. I then realized that something was the matter. I at once went to the staterooms of all my friends and told them to dress in case we were called up. Second-class passenger Edwina Troutt.
Laura Francatelli was told she would be safe, but she knew the ship was in trouble.
When I left my room, the water was on my deck, coming along the corridor. We were 20 feet above the water level, so we'd already sunk 20 feet. Everybody I passed assured me I was safe. First-class servant, Laura Francatelli.
Anna Sjoblom was one of many third-class passengers who could not find her way to the decks and lifeboats above.
The stairway was closed. It seems that those in charge were sure that the ship would be saved, and I suppose did not think it best to have more people above than necessary. Third-class passenger Anna Sjoblom.
Many passengers couldn't comprehend that their ship was actually sinking.
I'd made my way up the promenade deck where I saw 3 ladies arm in arm walking up and down. I said to them, I says, "You come along with me," I said. "The ship's sinking and we'll go up and see if there's any lifeboats left." She said, "We're all right, steward. The ship can't sink. We don't want to go down in one of those little boats." I left them and went up to the boat deck. Steward, Arthur Lewis.
One passenger helped save time, and perhaps more lives, by informing Captain Smith that the A-deck promenade's closed windows would keep passengers from boarding the lifeboats.
Upon noticing that the thick plate glass windows protecting the greater length of the promenade deck blocked egress, I walked up to Smith, saluted him, and said, "Excuse me, sir, but are you aware that all the windows on that deck are closed?" The captain, on hearing this, replied, "My God, you are right," and at once altered his orders, made the passengers assemble on the boat deck, and manned the boats from that deck. First-class passenger Hugh Woolner.
In the sailors' haste to load the lifeboats, some families were torn apart.
A sailor caught Marjorie in his arms and tore her away from me and threw her in. She was not even given a chance to tell her father goodbye. I clung desperately to my husband. I heard him say, "Go, Lottie, for God's sake. Be brave and go. I'll get a seat in another boat." The men who held me rushed me bodily across the deck and hurled me into the lifeboat. Second-class passenger Charlotte Collyer.
Some women didn't realize they were leaving Titanic without their husbands until it was too late.
My husband put me on, and as he tried to join me, 2 policemen grabbed him as they wanted to save all the women and children first. I began yelling and crying, and I wanted to join him on the sinking ship, The boat was paddled away from the Titanic so fast that I couldn't jump off to be with my husband. Third-class passenger, Salini Yasbeck.
As the ship was sinking, men who failed to follow the rules were dealt with severely.
A steerage passenger, an Italian, I think, came running the whole length of the deck and hurled himself into the boat. He fell upon a young child and injured her internally. The officer pushed him back onto the Titanic. I caught a last glimpse of this coward in the hands of about a dozen men. They were driving their fists into his face. Second-class passenger, Charlotte Collyer.
Some desperate men tried anything to escape the sinking Titanic.
A man dressed as a woman jumped into the lifeboat as it was going down, and the officer said, "I've a good mind to shoot you. You might have capsized the boat." Second-class passenger Edith Brown.
Stewardess Violet Jessop left Titanic with a stranger's baby.
I turned to see young Mason who'd been busy filling a boat. His face looked weary and tired, but he gave a bright smile as he ordered my group into the boat, calling out good luck as we stepped in, helped by his willing guiding hand. Then he hailed me and held up something, calling as he prepared to throw it, "Look after this, will ya?" And I reached out to receive someone's forgotten baby in my arms. It started to whimper as I pressed it to me, the hard cork surface of the lifebelt being anything but a comfort. Poor mite. Stewardess Violet Jessop.
As Titanic was sinking, her officers prepared for the worst.
It was about this time that the chief officer came over from the starboard side and asked did I know where the firearms were. I told the chief officer, "Yes, I know where they are. Come along and I'll get them for you." And into the first officer's cabin we went, the chief, Murdoch, the captain and myself, where I hauled them out, still in all their pristine newness and grease. I was going out when the chief shoved one of the revolvers into my hands with a handful of ammunition and said, "Here you are, you may need it." On the impulse, I just slipped it into my pocket, along with the cartridges, and returned to the boats. The whole incident had not taken 3 minutes, though it barely seemed worth that precious time. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
James Witter's life was saved by accident.
On my way to the upper deck, I met the second purser, who told me to clear the cabins of passengers and ensure that they all had lifebelts. This I did, then carried on to the upper deck and stood by number 11 boat, where I assisted the women and children to get on board. As the boat was about to be lowered, a hysterical woman tried to clamber into the boat, so I stood on the guardrail to assist her in. As she half fell into the boat, I went in with her. The boat was then being lowered. Steward James Witter.
Dr. Washington Dodge was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right moment.
When boat number 13 was being lowered from the A-deck, it stayed there for at least 2 minutes, while the officers in charge were calling for more women and children. But as none responded, the officers said, "Some of you men tumble in," and I tumbled. First-class passenger Dr. Washington Dodge.
Second Officer Lightoller watched the water rise as he supervised the lowering of the port lifeboats.
Between one boat being lowered away and the next boat being prepared, I usually nipped along to have a look down the very long emergency staircase leading direct from boat deck down to sea deck. Actually built as a shortcut for the crew, it served my purpose now to gauge the speed with which the water was rising and how high it had got. By now, the foredeck was below the surface. That cold green water crawling its ghostly way up that staircase was a sight that stamped itself indelibly on my memory. Step by step it made its way up, covering the electric lights one after another, which for a time shone under the surface with a horribly weird effect. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
Bruce Ismay defended his escape in collapsible lifeboat C.
I did not see anyone on deck, and I could only assume that the other passengers had gone to the other end of the ship. The boat was being actually lowered away. White Star Director, Bruce Ismay.
Jack Thayer was on the edge of a crowd that tried to avoid the rising water.
Now, without warning, she seemed to start forward, moving forward and into the water at an angle of about 15 degrees. This movement, with the water rushing up toward us, was accompanied by a rumbling roar, mixed with more muffled explosions. It was like standing under a steel railway bridge while an express train passes overhead, mingled with the noise of a pressed steel factory and wholesale breakage of china. First-class passenger, Jack Thayer.
Charles Lightoller narrowly avoided the falling funnel.
The terrific strain of the after end of that huge hull clearing the water caused the expansion joint aft number 1 funnel to open up. The port wire parted to be followed almost immediately by the starboard one, giving this huge structure a pull over to that side of the ship, causing it to fall with its scores of tons right amongst the struggling mass of humanity already in the water. It struck the water between Collapsible B and the ship, actually missing me by inches. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
One survivor's story proved Titanic's stern went down with no suction at all.
In the last few moments, those left behind made a mad rush toward what they considered a safer place, the poop deck. Fortunately, I was all alone when a big list to port occurred. I was able to straddle the starboard rail on A deck and stepped off as the ship went under. I had expected suction of some kind, but felt none. At no time was my head under water. Chief Baker, Charles Joughin.
Charlotte Collyer watched Titanic disappear as she clutched her daughter Marjorie in Lifeboat 14.
Before the darkness came, I saw hundreds of human bodies clinging to the wreck or jumping into the water. Cries more terrible than I have ever heard rung in my ears. I turned my face away, but I looked round the next moment and saw the other half of the great ship slip below the surface of the water as easily as a pebble in a pond. I shall always remember that last moment as the most hideous of the whole disaster. Second-class passenger Charlotte Collyer.
Jack Thayer, shivering on the swamped Collapsible B, heard the voices of those still in the water after Titanic disappeared.
Probably a minute passed with almost dead silence and quiet. Then an individual called for help, from here, from there, gradually swelling into a composite volume of one long continuous wailing chant from the 1,500 in the water all around us. It sounded like locusts on a midsummer night in the woods in Pennsylvania. The terrible continuing cry lasted for 20 or 30 minutes, gradually dying away as one after another could no longer stand the cold and exposure. Practically no one was drowned, as no water was found in the lungs of those later recovered. Everyone had on a life preserver. The partially filled lifeboat standing by only a few hundred yards away never came back. Why on earth they did not come back is a mystery. How could any human being fail to heed those cries? First-class passenger, Jack Thayer.
Seaman Joseph Scarrott recalls returning to rescue surviving swimmers.
We tied all our boats together so as to form a large object on the water which would be seen quicker than a single boat by a passing vessel. We divided the passengers of our boat amongst the other 4, and then, taking one man from each boat so as to make a crew, we rowed away amongst the wreckage as we heard cries for help coming from that direction. Seaman Joseph Scarrott.
Seaman Joseph Scarrott told of Lifeboat 14's heartbreaking and nearly futile hunt for survivors in the water.
We were amongst hundreds of dead bodies floating in lifebelts. We could only see 4 alive. The first one we picked up was a male passenger. He died shortly after we got him in the boat. After a hard struggle, we managed to get the other 3. One of these we saw kneeling as if in prayer upon what appeared to be a part of a staircase. He was only about 20 yards away from us, but it took us half an hour to push our boat through the wreckage and bodies to get to him. Even then we could not get very close, so we put out an oar for him to get hold of and so pulled him to the boat. All the bodies we saw seemed as if they'd perished with the cold, as their limbs were all cramped up. As we left that awful scene, we gave way to tears. It was enough to break the stoutest heart. Seaman Joseph Scarrott.